He had buried her twice. Once in the ground, or tried to, when they found nothing but her shawl tangled in river reeds, and once inside himself, in a locked chamber of his chest where he allowed nothing living to remain. Duke Nathaniel Blackthorne was a man who had learned that grief, left unmanaged, became something else entirely, a hunger that ate through reason and left only the cold, methodical machinery of a man who no longer required hope to function. 3 years. 3 years of functioning. And then a door opened on a rainy Tuesday evening in a village that didn't appear on any map he trusted, and everything he had so carefully dismantled inside himself lurched back to life like a body refusing to stay in the grave. Tut. The rain came down in sheets by the time Nathaniel's carriage reached the outskirts of Dunore Hollow. It was not a place a duke ought to visit. The village existed in that liminal space between forgotten and deliberately overlooked, a scattering of stone cottages wedged between the moor and a tree line so dense that the afternoon light never quite penetrated to the ground. His driver had protested twice on the road from Ashford, and Nathaniel had said nothing in response either time, which the man had learned, over 4 years of service, was far more final than any spoken command. The village did not appear on the Ordnance Survey maps. It appeared, however, in the correspondence of a dead man, a solicitor named Hargrove, who had been quietly managing a network of false identities for what Nathaniel now understood was a deliberately organized political machine. Hargrove had died of natural causes 6 months prior, or so the coroner's report stated. Nathaniel had read the report 3 times and noted, each time, that the coroner had been appointed to his position by Lord Aldrich Pemberton, whose name appeared in 3 separate coded letters Nathaniel had decoded over the past 8 months. He did not yet have proof of anything. He had only threads, and the particular kind of patience that grows in a man once he has nothing left to lose. He had been following a thread tonight. A woman named Margaret Hollis, who had once worked as a lady's maid in Pemberton's household, had been relocated to Dunmore Hollow 2 years ago under circumstances that the local magistrate had found unremarkable and that Nathaniel found deeply interesting. She was listed in the parish record as a seamstress. She had given a deposition to a parliamentary investigator 18 months ago that contained 3 specific inconsistencies Nathaniel had cross-referenced against testimony from 2 other witnesses. He wanted to speak with her. He wanted, more specifically, to show her a document and watch her face while she read it. The carriage stopped at the edge of the village green. There were perhaps 12 structures visible through the rain. Lamplight leaked from a few windows, orange and domestic, entirely indifferent to him. He stepped out without waiting for the footboard to be lowered, and his boots found mud immediately. "Wait here," he told the driver. "If I'm not back in an hour, return to the inn at Ashford and send word to my solicitor." The driver, a man named Pollard, who had, on at least 2 occasions, demonstrated the kind of loyalty that cannot be purchased, only inherited, gave a single nod, and said nothing about the rain soaking through his coat. Nathaniel walked. He had the address from a parish record, and he had been studying parish records for long enough that he could read them the way other men read novels, with a particular awareness of where the author was lying. The address placed Margaret Hollis at the second-to-last cottage on the far side of the green, set slightly apart from its neighbors by a low stone wall and an overgrown garden that in summer would have been deliberately lush. Someone had planted climbing roses along the front, now stripped bare by autumn and climbing the stone like skeletal fingers. He noted this without sentiment. He noted everything without sentiment. It was one of the things he had become proficient at in the years since. The gate was unlatched. He passed through it. There was lamplight behind the cottage's front window, warm, amber, and interrupted occasionally by a shadow moving inside. Someone was awake. Someone was moving with the unhurried ease of a person in their own home, certain of their own safety, unaware that safety in any form was an arrangement that could be undone. He knocked. Silence inside. The shadow stilled. He knocked again, harder, because he had not come this far in the rain to be made to wait on a doorstep. "Who is it?" A woman's voice from inside, cautious, low, accented in a way that placed her from the West Counties. Not fear in the voice exactly, but the careful construction of a person who had learned to compose themselves before responding to unexpected sounds. "I need to speak with a woman named Margaret Hollis regarding a legal matter," Nathaniel said. I am not a constable, and I am not here to cause distress. I have a document I believe she will want to see." A long pause, long enough that he began calculating whether the cottage had a rear exit and whether he'd have time to circle around if she bolted. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. He had prepared himself in the way he always prepared himself before these encounters, emotionally reduced to nothing, professionally exact, ready for any variety of frightened or hostile witness. He had conducted 47 such conversations over the past 3 years. He was very good at them. The door opened. The lamp was behind her, and for a single half-second she was only a silhouette. Slight build, dark hair loose around her shoulders, one hand braced against the doorframe with the unconscious self-possession of someone who had learned to fill space with their body rather than shrink into it. Then she stepped forward slightly, and the lamplight caught her face. Nathaniel Blackthorne, who had not made an involuntary sound in public since the night he received the letter informing him that his wife's belongings had been found at the river's edge, stopped breathing. The woman in the doorway was not Margaret Hollis. She was Celeste. She was his wife. She was standing in a cottage doorway in a village that did not appear on any map, looking at him with dark eyes that he had memorized 3 years ago over a grave that contained nothing, and she did not, with absolute devastating clarity, recognize him. The first thing he thought, in the strange split second before thought organized itself into something functional, was that he was looking at a ghost. Not in the fanciful sense, in the clinical sense, the brain producing what it desperately required to see, overlaid on a stranger's face. He held that thought for exactly as long as it took him to catalog, with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 3 years interrogating evidence. The particular set of her jaw that he had once told her made her look like she was perpetually calculating the structural integrity of every room she entered. The small scar above her left eyebrow from a riding accident at 17 that she had told him about on the 3rd night of their marriage, because they had been talking in the dark for 3 hours and she had run out of more important things to say. The way she stood with her weight shifted slightly to her right hip, a habit she'd had for as long as he'd known her that no impersonator would have bothered to reproduce because it was not the kind of detail that made it into descriptions. This was not a ghost. This was not his mind performing the ugly trick that grief sometimes played on exhausted men. This was Celeste, 3 years dead, standing in a doorway, looking at him like he was a stranger who had come to her door in the rain. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was the same. It was the same voice. There was something in the register, something in the particular texture of the way she shaped her consonants, that he would have known in a dark room. He stopped. The word came out wrong, stripped of the professional composure he'd entered the garden with, and he heard it happen and couldn't correct it. "I'm looking for Margaret Hollis. She doesn't live here." No apology in it. No invitation to linger. The voice of a woman who opened her door carefully and planned to close it the same way. "Who are you?" The question came out without varnish, without the procedural framing he normally wrapped around everything. It came out the way things did when the mechanism failed. Her chin lifted slightly. "That's not a question I answer for strangers on my doorstep." "No," he said slowly. "I don't imagine it is." He was staring at her. He was aware he was staring, and he could not manufacture the professional remove that would make him stop. He had spent 3 years making himself into the kind of man who could look at anything without flinching, and he was flinching now. Not outwardly, not in any way she could have named, but something in his chest was doing something structural and irreversible, like a wall that had been standing too long finally finding its crack. She was starting to look uncomfortable. Good. He filed that away. Not the discomfort of guilt, exactly, more the discomfort of a person who was used to being looked through rather than at. "If you're looking for Margaret Hollis, she moved on 6 months ago," she said. "I couldn't tell you where." "When did you move here?" "Excuse me?" "To this cottage. When did you take it?" The discomfort sharpened into something with an edge. "I don't see how that's your business." "It isn't," he agreed. "I'm asking anyway." She looked at him for a moment the way he was used to looking at evidence, cataloging, weighing, deciding how much to give away. He recognized the look with a physical sensation just below his sternum that he could not have named and would not have tried. 2 years ago," she said finally. "If you're done, I'd like to close my door." "What's your name?" "Evelyn." A beat of hesitation so brief he might have missed it if he hadn't been paying the particular quality of attention he was paying. "Evelyn Hart." He let that sit in the air between them. "Evelyn Hart," he repeated, not questioning it, just putting it back in the space between them so they could both see its shape. "Good night." She began to close the door. He put his hand on it, not roughly. He simply placed his palm flat against the wood and held it still, and she went very quiet on the other side of it. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "Take your hand off my door." Very quiet, very even. A voice that had been schooled against panic so thoroughly that the schooling itself had become audible. He did. He removed his hand and stepped back, and she pushed the door halfway closed and stood behind it with just her face showing. Guarded, alert, entirely still. He had seen that stillness before. He had watched it in the early months of their marriage when she had been learning to trust that stillness was something she was permitted as opposed to a warning sign. "Margaret Hollis," he said carefully, "she was here 2 years ago. She left 6 months ago. You've been here 2 years. That puts you here at the same time." He was not accusing. He was laying it out the way he laid out evidence, sequentially, without decoration. "I need to know what she told you before she left." "She didn't tell me anything." "Did you know her well?" "She was my neighbor." "Did she seem frightened before she left?" A pause. The door neither opened nor closed. "She seemed like a woman who had reasons," the woman who called herself Evelyn Hart said, and the phrasing was so specifically careful that he felt it land in him like something with weight. "Most people do," he said. She looked at him for another moment through the gap in the door. The rain was coming harder now, and he was soaked through his coat, and he could feel it and was not particularly concerned about it. He was concerned about the way she was looking at him, with the particular careful quality of someone deciding whether this specific man represented a threat or a resource, and not yet having enough information to determine which. "You should go," she said. "I'll come back," he said. "I won't answer." "You'll answer." It wasn't a threat. It came out as something flatter and more truthful than that. The simple prediction of a man who had spent 3 years becoming very good at making people open doors they'd decided to keep closed. She shut the door. He heard the bolt slide home. He stood in the rain for a moment, looking at the wood, and then he turned and walked back toward the green. Chikots. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the room Pollard had secured at the inn in Ashford, a low-ceilinged space that smelled of damp wool and the particular melancholy of rooms that had housed too many solitary travelers. And he laid everything he had on the small writing table and looked at it. The folder of decoded correspondence, the list of false identities, the parish records, the notes on Hargrove's estate, the photograph he carried in the breast pocket of his coat, which he had not looked at in 14 months, because he had decided 14 months ago that looking at it was a form of self-destruction he could no longer afford. He took it out now. It was small, slightly bent at one corner from years of being carried against his chest, and it showed the two of them at some function or another, he could no longer remember which. And she was looking at the camera with the exact expression the woman in the cottage doorway had used when she'd decided whether to answer his question, the particular quality of her stillness, the precise angle of her jaw. He put the photograph down on the table. Then he picked up the Dunore Hollow parish record and read it again from the beginning. Evelyn Hart, listed as a widow, arrived approximately 2 years ago. Listed occupation, seamstress. No family connections noted. No known previous address. The entry was written in the careful hand of a local clerk and was entirely unremarkable except for one detail that he had passed over the first time he'd read it, and now felt like a splinter under his thumbnail. The date of her registration in the parish was exactly 11 days after the date on which Celeste's personal solicitor had been quietly replaced by a man with connections to Pemberton's legal office. 11 days. He stared at that. 3 years ago, his wife had gone to visit her cousin at a country estate 40 miles northeast of Blackthorne Manor. The carriage had been found overturned at a river crossing. Her shawl, her traveling case, 2 items of jewelry. No body. The river had been dredged. Witnesses at the last posting inn had reported seeing her depart in good spirits. The death had been ruled accidental by drowning, and the body declared unrecoverable given the current speed that time of year. He had accepted that. He had not accepted it easily or without destroying a significant amount of furniture in the 6 months that followed, but he had accepted it. He had accepted it because the alternative, that someone had staged it, that someone with enough power had reached into his life and removed the person at its center, required a level of conspiratorial architecture that he had initially dismissed as the grief-addled fantasy of a man who needed someone to blame. He no longer dismissed it. He pulled the map across the table and measured, with 2 fingers, the distance between the site of the carriage accident and Dunore Hollow. 34 miles. He measured the distance between Dunore Hollow and Pemberton's primary estate, 60 miles. He measured the distance between Dunore Hollow and the estate of Pemberton's closest political ally, a man named Ashworth, whose name he'd found twice in Hargrove's correspondence. 11 miles. He sat with that geometry for a long time. Then he thought about the way she had looked at him in the doorway. Not with the blankness of a stranger, but with the specific careful distance of a person who had been trained by something into the habit of treating all unknown faces as potential threats. He thought about her voice, which was exactly as he remembered it, except flattened somehow. The particular music of it present but muted, like a piano that had been moved and not quite tuned back to true. He thought about the 11-day gap and the replaced solicitor and Margaret Hollis, who had been here and was now gone, and the cottage with its climbing roses stripped bare by autumn. He thought about the way she had said, "She seemed like a woman who had reasons." He did not sleep. He worked. He cross-referenced every entry in Hargrove's correspondence against the timeline of his wife's disappearance, looking for the thread he had missed because he'd been starting from the wrong premise, the premise that Celeste was dead. And he found 3 of them in 2 hours, each one a small thing that meant nothing on its own, each one a link in a chain that had been assembled by someone who was very good at making chains look like coincidences. By 4 in the morning, he had stopped looking at the evidence on the table. He was looking at the photograph. In it, Celeste was half turned toward him, and there was something in her expression that he had always privately thought of as the look, the one she'd had when she was deciding whether to trust him with something true. They had been married for 2 years when the photograph was taken. He had spent the first year of that marriage learning the difference between the version of herself she offered to the world and the version that existed underneath it, and the process had been neither graceful nor particularly kind to either of them, because Nathaniel Blackthorne had been, at 28, a man of formidable intelligence and almost no emotional vocabulary, and Celeste had been a woman who had learned very early to protect the interior of herself like contested territory. They had arrived slowly and with significant collateral damage at something that functioned as intimacy. And then she had gone to visit her cousin and not come back. He put the photograph in his pocket. He folded the map. He organized the documents into their folder. He laid out tomorrow's plan with the precision of a man who had learned to make plans the way other men made prayers. Not from hope, but because the alternative was chaos, and chaos was the one thing he genuinely could not afford. In the morning, he would go back to Dunore Hollow. He would bring the document he had brought for Margaret Hollis, which contained, among other things, the names of 4 individuals connected to Pemberton's network of false identities. And he would show it to the woman in the cottage, and he would watch her face while she read it, because whatever she was, and whatever she remembered, and whatever had been done to her, she was not nothing to him. And she was not a stranger, and he needed her to understand that both of those things were true simultaneously, even though they had not yet arrived at a language for it. He blew out the lamp. In the dark, he sat still for a very long time, doing nothing useful whatsoever, which was the closest thing to grief he permitted himself anymore. The morning arrived gray and deliberate, the kind of light that made everything look like a decision that hadn't been made yet. He was back at the cottage gate by 8 o'clock. The garden looked different in daylight, less skeletal, more considered. Someone had taken care of it not long ago. The roses had been pruned, not neglected. There were herbs growing along the south-facing wall, neatly tended, the kind of small domestic mastery that is practiced by people who have decided to put down roots in a place even while knowing the roots might not hold. He opened the gate and walked to the door and knocked. Quicker response this time. the bolt drawn back without the long pause. She had clearly decided overnight how she was going to handle this. The door opened, and she looked at him with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had made a plan and was executing it. "I spoke to Mr. Alderman this morning," she said. "He's the village magistrate. He knows you're here, and he knows your name." "Good," Nathaniel said. "Then you know I'm not hiding what I'm doing." A flicker of something. Not quite surprise, but the adjustment of a calculation. She had expected him to be unsettled by this. He watched her recalibrate. "What do you want?" "To show you something." "I already told you. This isn't about Margaret Hollis anymore." He reached into his coat and removed the document. 4 pages, folded once. He held it out. "I want you to look at the names on page 3. She didn't take it. "Why?" "Because one of them is the name of a solicitor who managed the estate of a woman who died 3 years ago, and I believe you know who that woman was, and I believe you know what that solicitor did, and I believe that is the reason you are standing in a cottage in a village that isn't on any map I trusted, calling yourself a name that isn't yours." Very still. The door had not closed. She had not stepped back. She was absolutely still in the doorway, and he could see her deciding. Could see it in the quality of her breathing, in the almost imperceptible tension along her jaw. Whether this was the moment to run or the moment to stay. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said. "Take the document and read page 3, he said, "and then tell me I don't know what I'm talking about." A long beat. The moor wind moved through the garden, bare rose canes clicking softly against the stone. She took the document. She unfolded it carefully. That deliberateness, that refusal to handle anything hastily, and turned to page 3, and he watched her read. He watched her read, and he watched the blood leave her face with the slow precision of something being drained, and he watched her eyes track across a name he already knew by heart, and he watched her hand tighten on the paper until the knuckles went white. "Where did you get this?" The question came out low, scrubbed of its surface composure, and underneath it was something that was not quite fear and not quite fury, but was made of both. "From the estate of a dead solicitor named Hargrove." Her eyes came up from the paper and found his, and for the first time since she'd opened the door, he saw it. The thing beneath the careful blankness, the thing that the woman calling herself Evelyn Hart was protecting with every locked door and flat voice and practiced stillness. Recognition. Not of him. Of something. Of the name on page 3, and what that name meant, and what its presence in his hand signaled about how much he already knew. "You need to leave," she said. The voice was barely even now. "You need to take this and leave and not come back." "Why?" "Because if anyone sees you here—" She stopped. Started again. "If anyone sees you talking to me, they'll know. They'll know I talked. And then it won't matter where I—" Another stop. Her jaw tightened. "You don't understand what you've walked into." "Then explain it to me." "I can't." "You can. You don't know who these people are." She thrust the document back at him, and he took it without looking away from her face. "You've been following paper trails like a clever man who thinks cleverness is sufficient, and it isn't. It is not sufficient. You have no idea—" She broke off again, and he saw with a kind of quiet devastation that her eyes had gone bright. Not with tears exactly, more with the extreme effort of containing something that was attempting to surface. "Please go." "I'm not going," he said. "Why not?" It was the first genuine question she had asked him, not defensive, not procedural, the raw question of a person who needed an actual answer. He looked at her, at the face he had memorized, the scar above the eyebrow, the way she stood with her weight on her right hip. And he said the only true thing he had said since he'd arrived at her door. "Because I've been looking for you for 3 years, he said, "and I'm not leaving until you tell me your real name." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the architecture of a room. She looked at him, and something in her face, something layered deep below all the careful defenses, something she had clearly been protecting with the full structural weight of a manufactured life, began, almost imperceptibly, to crack. "How do you know?" Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "How do you know it isn't Hart?" "Because," he said quietly, I know what your name is. The wind moved through the rose canes. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked twice and went silent. She stood in the doorway of her borrowed life, holding a document that confirmed everything she had spent 2 years trying to forget, looking at a man she had apparently decided, or been made to decide, she did not know. And her face was doing something it had clearly not been permitted to do in a very long time. "Evelyn," she said finally, the single word, flat, final, a door being held shut by the last of her strength. "That's not your name," he said. "It's the only name I have." "It isn't." He took one step closer. Not threatening, deliberate. The step of a man who had been very patient for a very long time and had arrived at the end of patience. "Say your real name. Say it once, out loud, to me." And she opened her mouth, and what came out of it was not a name. What came out was a sound, low and involuntary, the kind that escapes the body when it is ambushed by something it thought it had successfully buried. And then she pressed her lips together, and her eyes closed briefly, and when they opened again, they were different. Not the careful blankness, something older than that, something that had been living underneath the invented life, waiting. "I don't know you," she said. And even as she said it, something in the quality of the statement shifted. It arrived less as a fact and more as a question, as a line being tried against the air to see if it would hold. It did not hold. He could see it not holding. "I think," he said slowly, watching her face, "that part of you does." Behind her, inside the cottage, something fell. They both turned, and the window beside the door shattered inward, glass across the stone floor, and through the broken frame came a man's arm, and in that arm's grip was a piece of paper that landed at her feet, and the arm withdrew. And they heard running footsteps disappearing into the tree line, and the paper lay there in the glass and the lamplight, and even from where he stood, Nathaniel could see the 2 words written on it. "Stop looking." The note lay in the glass. Nathaniel looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to memorize the handwriting, the weight of the ink, the particular angle of the letters that told him whoever had written it was educated and left-handed, and had been in enough of a hurry that the final word ran slightly downhill. Then he stepped over the threshold, past the woman who had not moved, and crossed to the broken window. The tree line was 40 yards from the cottage. The footsteps had been heavy, deliberate, not panicked. Someone who had delivered the message and left because the message was the point, not the confrontation. "How long have you been watched?" he said. Behind him, the woman who called herself Evelyn Hart bent and picked up the note. He heard her breath catch when she read it. Not a gasp, smaller than that, the involuntary sound of a person whose worst calculation has been confirmed. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." He turned from the window. "How long?" She set the note on the table with the careful deliberateness of a person who is using the act of setting things down to organize themselves. "You need to leave. Both of us need to—" She stopped. "You need to leave. Someone just threw a warning through your window. I'm aware of that. Which means they know I'm here. Which means they were watching this cottage already, or they followed me from Ashford, or both." He crossed the room toward her, and she took one step back. Not fear exactly, more the instinctive repositioning of someone recalculating distance, and he stopped 3 feet from her and kept his voice level. "Leaving right now does not make you safer. It makes you a moving target, which is considerably more dangerous than a stationary one. Being near you makes me a target. You were already a target. You've been a target for 3 years. He watched her jaw tighten. "The note says stop looking. They wrote it for me, not for you. Which means they're more concerned about what I know than about what you know. Which means I've gotten close enough to something that someone felt it was worth breaking your window on a Tuesday morning to make a point." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp was still burning despite the thin morning light coming through the broken window, and it caught the side of her face and showed him, in that particular amber quality, just how much effort it was costing her to stand still. "What do you know?" she said. "Enough to have made someone nervous." He pulled a chair from the table and sat in it, because he had found, over 3 years of difficult conversations, that sitting while the other person stood was a reliable way to signal that he was not going anywhere. "Sit down." "I'm fine standing." "I know you are." Sit down anyway. She sat. Not because he'd told her to, he understood, but because her body had apparently made its own decision about whether her legs were going to keep holding her up, and the decision had come down against it. He opened the document folder he had set on the table. He took out the page with the names and laid it flat between them. "Read the second name on that list," he said. She looked at it. Her face did not change. "I've already read it." "Read it again, out loud." A beat. "Hargrove. Thomas Hargrove, solicitor. Died 8 months ago. He was found in his office with a sealed letter on his desk that was addressed to the parliamentary investigator assigned to Pemberton's case." He tapped the page. The letter was never delivered. It was intercepted by a clerk who was subsequently promoted. I know this because the clerk made the mistake of depositing a sum of money that was exactly £40 more than his annual salary could account for. And the bank manager was old and honest and found it worth mentioning to a friend of mine. She was looking at the page, not at him. Hargrove managed false identities, Nathaniel continued. He was very good at it. Parish records, property registrations, letters of introduction for women who needed to stop being whoever they'd been and become someone else. He watched the side of her face. He did it for Pemberton's network, but he also apparently did it for individuals. On request. For the right kind of money. "You're speculating." "I'm not. I have his ledger." He let that land. Encrypted, but the encryption was Hargrove's own system, and Hargrove was a man of consistent habits. The key was in his desk drawer, written on the inside cover of a Latin dictionary. He paused. The ledger lists 12 individual cases over 14 years, women mostly. 1 entry per case, initials, a date, a location, a sum paid, and a notation of the new identity provided. He looked at her directly. The entry dated 3 years and 2 months ago lists the initials CB, a sum of £400, the location of a village 60 miles northeast of Ashford, and the name Evelyn Hart. The silence was total. She sat very still. The quality of her stillness was different from before. Not controlled, but suspended. The stillness of a person who has stepped onto ice and is waiting to learn whether it will hold. "CB," she said finally. The 2 letters, flat and careful. "Celeste Blackthorne," he said. Her eyes came to his, and something in them, something that had been very carefully sealed, gave a single violent lurch, like a door hit from outside by a force it wasn't built for. "That's not—" She stopped. "Say it isn't." Her mouth closed. "Say it's not your name," he said. "Say it out loud and I'll believe you, and I'll walk out that door and you can go back to being Evelyn Hart for whatever time you have left before whoever threw that note decides you're a liability instead of a loose end. Say it." She did not say it. The lamp burned. A piece of broken glass shifted on the floor in the wind from the open window. "Who are you?" she said. The question came out stripped of everything. No armor in it, nothing performed. The raw question of someone who had been running for a very long time and had arrived unexpectedly at a wall. He had thought about this. In the inn at Ashford, across the sleepless hours, he had thought about exactly this moment, and exactly what he would say, and he had constructed 4 different versions of the answer, and now that the moment was here, all 4 versions dissolved, and what was left was the thing he had not allowed himself to say for 3 years. "My name is Nathaniel Blackthorne," he said. "I am the 8th Duke of Blackthorne, and you are my wife." Thud. She stood up so fast the chair scraped back hard across the stone floor. "No." Flat, absolute. A word used as a wall. "I know what you were told." "I wasn't told anything." She had gone to the far side of the room, not running, backing, deliberately, the way someone backs away from something they need distance from in order to think clearly. "I don't know you. I don't know that name. I don't—" "Celeste." She stopped. He had not used the name before this. He used it now the way you use a key, not to force anything, just to see if the lock was there. Her back was to him. He watched her spine, the particular way her shoulders had locked, the stillness that was no longer controlled but arrested. "Don't," she said, very quiet. "You know that name?" "I said don't." "Why? Because it belongs to someone you remember being, or because it belongs to someone you were told is dead?" She turned around. Her face was not the careful blankness anymore. That had been stripped off somewhere between his sitting down and his speaking her name, and what was underneath it was raw and more honest and considerably more frightening to look at, because it was the face of a person who had organized an entire life around a specific story about themselves and was now standing in the rubble of it. "I don't remember you," she said. "I know. I don't remember any of it. The name, the title, any of it. I remember—" She stopped, started again, and he could see it costing her the way the words had to be physically extracted. "I remember waking up in a room I didn't know, with people I didn't know, and everything before that was—" Her hand moved briefly to the back of her head, a gesture so unconscious she clearly didn't know she was making it. There was nothing. There was just the waking up. He looked at her hand, at the gesture. "You hit your head," he said. She did not confirm it, she did not deny it. "In the carriage accident," he said, "at the river crossing. The carriage went over and you hit your head and you ended up—" He was working through it as he spoke, the pieces rearranging themselves in his mind with the particular clicking certainty of a mechanism finding its true configuration. "You ended up somewhere, with someone, and they made sure you stayed there. You don't know that. Someone paid Hargrove £400 to give you a name and a location and a history that didn't exist." He kept his voice even, not because he felt even. Underneath the controlled professional machinery, something was happening that he hadn't budgeted for, something loud and ungovernable that he was going to have to address later when there was time. "Someone paid £400 for you to disappear and stay disappeared. That's not an accident, that's an investment." She crossed her arms. It was not a defensive gesture. It was the gesture of a person physically holding themselves together. "Why would anyone—" "Because of what you knew." He stood up. "Before the accident, before everything, you were present for something, or you had access to something, or you were connected to something that made you dangerous to someone with a great deal of power and a great deal to lose." He came around the table slowly, not crowding her, just reducing the distance between them to something that required her to actually look at him. "I've been investigating Aldrich Pemberton's network for 3 years. Do you know that name?" The answer was in her face before she could decide whether to give it. "He's a peer," she said carefully. "He holds seat in the Lords. He—" She stopped. "You know him." "I know of him." "That's not what your face just said." He stopped 2 feet from her. "What do you know about Pemberton?" "Nothing I could prove." "Tell me anyway." "Why?" "So you can take it to someone and get yourself killed, and then whoever is watching this cottage will know I talked, and then—" She broke off, jaw tight, eyes very bright. "You think you've stumbled onto something. You've been following paper trails and decoding letters, and you think you understand what you're dealing with. You don't. These people don't send warnings twice. That note is the only warning you're going to get. If you go back to London with my name in your documents and start asking questions about a woman who is supposed to be dead, you will make yourself a liability. And people who work for Pemberton do not leave liabilities walking around." The speech was too specific, too detailed. The knowledge behind it was not theoretical. It was the knowledge of someone who had been living with it for 2 years, up close, personal, paid for, in the specific currency of a life invented from nothing. "You've been watching them," he said. "This whole time. You've been here, and you've been watching. I've been surviving. Those aren't different things." Something in her face, a flicker, brief, gone. Recognition of a thought she hadn't expected to find in someone else's mouth. "Tell me what you know about Pemberton," he said again. "Why should I trust you?" "You shouldn't. You've known me for 12 hours and I've broken your window, proximately, and told you things that have dismantled whatever peace you'd arranged for yourself here. Trust is not what I'm asking for." He held her gaze. "I'm asking for information. I have something you need. Hargrove's ledger, the decoded correspondence, enough documented evidence to make a case that would survive scrutiny at the highest level. You have something I need. Whatever you've gathered from 2 years of watching these people from the inside of a life they built for you. That's an exchange, not trust, business." She looked at him for a long time. You said you've been looking for 3 years, she said. Yes. For me, specifically? He did not look away. I started looking for answers. The two things became the same search. If I tell you what I know, she stopped, rearranged. If I tell you what I've observed over 2 years, if I tell you who has come through this village and what they said and what I saw, then I'm not Evelyn Hart anymore. I'm a witness. And witnesses don't get to live quietly in cottages with rose gardens. No, he said, they don't. She absorbed that. He watched her absorb it, watched the calculation moving behind her eyes, the weighing of everything she had built against everything she stood to lose by keeping it. The man who organized it, she said finally, quietly. The accident. It wasn't Pemberton directly. He doesn't get his hands near anything directly. There's an intermediary, a man named Voss. She watched his face. You know that name. He did. It had appeared once in the margin of a decoded letter, and he had not been able to identify it. He manages the network's difficult problems, she said. He's been to this village twice in 2 years. The second time was 4 months ago. He spoke to a man named Gruder who owns the mill at the edge of the village. He didn't know I saw him. A pause. He was asking about me, about whether I'd had any visitors, whether I'd asked any questions about my past. He's been maintaining surveillance. Yes. Then they already know I was here last night. Her silence confirmed it. And now they know I came back this morning, he said. Yes. The note wasn't a warning, he said, the calculation arriving complete and cold. It was a test. They wanted to see if I'd leave. She had clearly arrived at this conclusion before him. He could see it in the way she was already moving, already crossing to the narrow stairs in the back of the cottage, with the purposeful economy of a person who had, at some point, planned for this. I have things upstairs that I need to take, she said. I have... She stopped on the first step, turned back to look at him over her shoulder, and her face in that moment was stripped entirely of the inventory of defenses she'd been running since she opened the door last night. It was just her face, tired and clear and carrying something he recognized because he had been carrying the same thing in different weight for 3 years. I have documents, things I've collected, about Voss, about who comes through this village and why. Things that would... She stopped again. I'm not Evelyn Hart, she said. Not a question, not quite a statement, something between the two tested against the air. No, he said. You're not. She held his gaze for one more second. Then she went up the stairs, and he heard her moving above him with the rapid efficiency of someone who had kept a bag half-packed for 2 years without letting themselves know why. And he stood in the cottage with the broken window and the cold morning light and the note on the table and the weight of everything that had not yet been said, and he did the only thing available to him, which was to remain exactly where he was and wait. Outside in the tree line, nothing moved. That was the part that concerned him, because 30 minutes ago something had moved. Footsteps, a thrown object, a retreat. And now the tree line was still, and the village green was empty, and the lane that led out of Dunore Hollow toward Ashford was visible from the cottage door, and 3 minutes ago a rider had appeared at the far end of it and stopped, and was still stopping, not passing through, not approaching, waiting. He crossed to the broken window and looked at the rider without appearing to look. The old practiced technique of surveillance against surveillance, and catalogued. Dark coat, no livery, large horse built for distance rather than speed, a posture in the saddle that was too casual to be casual. He heard her footsteps on the stairs. Quick, light, a bag in her hand, a bundle of papers pressed against her chest with the protective arm wrap of someone carrying something they could not afford to lose. She came to stand beside him and looked where he was looking. The lane to Ashford, she said. One rider, blocking the only road out. There's a path through the moor, she said. It doesn't connect to anything until Cresswood, 5 miles east. Do you know it well enough to walk it in bad weather? She looked at him. I've walked it twice in the dark, she said. He picked up his folder from the table, tucked it into his coat, looked around the cottage once, the lamp still burning, the glass on the floor, the note that said, "Stop looking," still lying on the table where she had set it, and something in him registered the room the way you register a thing you are seeing for the last time, which is to say with more attention than you had given it when you expected to see it again. "Then we go now," he said, while they're still watching the lane. She did not argue. She did not hesitate. She walked to the door and he walked beside her and she opened it. And they stepped out into the gray morning together, into whatever came next, into the version of everything that neither of them had planned for, and both of them had been, in their different ways, preparing for without knowing it. Behind them, in the cottage, the lamp burned on. The note sat on the table. And at the end of the lane, the rider turned his horse very slowly, tracking movement he had just detected, and reached into his coat, and raised something to his face that caught the morning light and held it. Not a weapon. A mirror. Signaling. The moor did not forgive hesitation. Nathaniel had learned this in the first quarter mile. The ground that looked solid giving way underfoot without warning. The path Celeste navigated from memory, shifting under the gray light into something that required complete attention and left no room for the other thing his mind kept trying to do, which was process the fact that he was walking across a November moor beside his dead wife. She moved fast. Faster than he'd expected, with the particular competence of someone who had been using this path as an emergency exit in her mind for 2 years and was now discovering that mental rehearsal translated accurately to muscle. She had the bundle of papers tucked inside her coat now, one arm pressed across her chest to hold them, and she had not spoken since they'd left the cottage. He matched her pace and watched the tree line and did not speak either. 2 miles in, she stopped. He stopped beside her and followed her gaze. Ahead, where the path crested a low ridge before descending toward the Crestwood Road, a figure stood against the sky. Not moving, just standing. "That's not one of Voss's men," she said quietly. "Wrong build. You know his men by build. I've had 2 years to learn them." She studied the figure. "He's facing away from us. He doesn't know we're here yet. Can we go around? Not without losing 40 minutes and crossing the wet ground by the eastern gully. If Voss signaled from the village, they'll have riders on the Crestwood Road within the hour." Nathaniel looked at the figure on the ridge, then he looked at her. "Stay here." "Absolutely not. I'm not asking." "I heard you. I'm still not staying." She held his gaze with the flat directness he was beginning to understand was not stubbornness, but the habituated self-reliance of a woman who had kept herself alive in a dangerous position for 2 years by trusting no one's judgment but her own. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. Move. He moved. They went wide, crouching below the ridge line, using the shallow depression in the ground that Celeste seemed to know by instinct, and they came up behind the figure at an angle that kept the wind in their faces and the noise of their approach in the heather. Close enough, eventually, for Nathaniel to see what the man was looking at. The road below, and on it, moving at a canter, 2 riders heading in the direction of Dunore Hollow. Voss was not taking any chances. He was sealing the exits first. Nathaniel caught Celeste's eye and tilted his head back the way they'd come. Not retreat, reroute. And she read it immediately and moved, and they were back below the ridgeline before the figure turned. "The eastern gully," she said, when they were far enough away to speak. "How wet?" "Passable. Unpleasant." "How long?" "We lose the 40 minutes, but we come out below Crestwood, south of the road. If your driver went back to Ashford as you instructed—" "He did." "Then we need to reach Ashford without using the road." She said it plainly, the arithmetic of a problem being solved rather than the panic of a person being hunted. And something in Nathaniel registered this with a quality that was almost involuntary. She had become someone very specific in 2 years. Someone who had been built by difficulty into a particular shape. He did not yet know if he recognized that shape. He knew he respected it. "Show me the gully," he said. They reached Ashford in just under 3 hours. The last mile Celeste had walked with her jaw set and her breathing controlled and her left boot soaked through from the gully crossing, and she had not complained once, which told him more about the past 3 years of her life than anything she had said. Pollard was at the inn. He took one look at Nathaniel's face and the unfamiliar woman beside him and had the horses ready in 11 minutes without being asked to explain anything to anyone. In the carriage, heading east toward London, the silence between them changed texture. The urgent, functional silence of people in motion became something else, heavier, with more inside it. Celeste sat across from him with the bundle of papers on her lap and her hands flat on top of them and her eyes on the window. Her face in profile was doing the careful neutral thing again, but it was less convincing now. The moor had stripped some of the practiced surface away. "Tell me about Voss," he said. She did not turn from the window immediately. When she did, it was with the measured deliberateness of someone deciding how much to give. His full name is Edmund Voss. He worked as a military attaché before Pemberton brought him into the private network. He's not ideological. He works for money, which makes him more predictable than a true believer but more dangerous than a common criminal because he doesn't make emotional errors. She paused. He was the one who arranged the accident. You're certain? He came to the village 8 months after I arrived. He was checking on the work, making sure the identity had held. Her eyes came directly to his. He spoke to a woman named Aldred who had helped settle me in. He told her I was the widow of a man who had owed a debt to powerful people, and that my continued quiet existence depended on no one asking questions about my past. He framed it as protection. A beat. It wasn't protection. It was containment. Yes. She looked back at the window. The first time I saw him, I felt something, not recognition exactly, more like... She stopped. Her hand moved slightly on the papers. Like something in me knew the shape of the danger before my mind had organized it into a name. Nathaniel watched her. That word, recognition. She had used it carefully, the way someone uses a word when they're not certain how much weight it will bear. What else do you feel, he said, when you can't explain it? A long pause. Outside, the countryside moved past, gray and indifferent. Sometimes a word will surface, she said quietly. A name, or an image. Something specific enough that it can't be random, but without any context around it. A room with blue wallpaper, a horse with a white mark on its foreleg. She stopped. A man's voice, very low, reading something aloud in the dark. The last one landed in him like something physical. He had done that. In the first year of their marriage, when neither of them could sleep, he had read to her. He had found it easier than conversation. It gave his voice something to do that required nothing in return, and she had found it easier than lying awake in the particular silence of a house where two people were still learning whether they meant to be kind to each other. He did not say this. He filed it, the same way he filed everything, carefully, in the appropriate place, and kept his face level. "The papers you brought," he said. "What's in them?" She unfolded the bundle. She had organized them, he could see, not hurriedly but methodically, the kind of organization that had happened over time. Names, dates, the times Voss visited, what he drove, who he spoke to. 2 letters I intercepted, copied by hand, between Aldred and a man in Pemberton's office. She held up a sheet covered in small, precise handwriting. And this. He took it. A list of dates. Beside each date, a location and a name. He read down the list and felt the cold arrive before his mind had finished processing why. 3 of the names he recognized. 2 were men who had testified in Pemberton's favor during the parliamentary inquiry 18 months ago. 1 was a senior official in the Home Office. And beside one date, 18 months ago, a notation in her careful hand. Confirmed departure. Did not return. Body found at Warwick Gate. Reported accidental. He looked up. This man was a witness in the Pemberton inquiry. He withdrew his testimony 4 days before he died. Her voice was flat and factual and cost her something he could see. I don't know what they offered him or what they threatened him with. I know he was going to say something true and then he wasn't, and then he wasn't saying anything at all. And you've been holding this for 18 months, yes. Alone. She looked at him steadily. There was no one else. He held the paper and did not say what he was thinking, which was that she had been sitting in that cottage with this intelligence for 18 months and had had no mechanism to do anything with it, no one to hand it to, no structure of trust available to her because the last structure of trust she'd known had been dismantled by the same people the paper documented. What he thought, underneath that, was something with more heat and less control, and he put it where he put everything that could not be useful right now. This is enough, he said. Combined with what I have, the ledger, the decoded correspondence, the banking record. This is enough to build a case. Enough to do what with? Pemberton has 3 allies on the tribunal that would hear any formal complaint. He has 2 men in the Home Office and 1 in the Lord Chancellor's office. She was watching him with the specific quality of someone who has done this calculation many times before. Every institution that should prosecute him has someone in it who won't. Not every institution. Which one doesn't? Harrington. She went still. The Lord Chief Justice. He and Pemberton were rivals before they were enemies. There's no sum of money large enough to make Harrington do Pemberton a favor, and Harrington has been looking for a way to dismantle him for 7 years. He folded her document carefully and placed it with his own. He'll hear it. He'll hear all of it. But he needs it presented publicly, before the House of Lords, in a manner that makes suppression impossible, in a manner that... The carriage stopped. Not gradually. It stopped the way carriages stop when something has been placed in the road. Nathaniel was at the door before the motion had fully ceased. Old reflexes, the kind installed in men who had been in situations where speed of response was the difference between options and the absence of them. He opened the door and looked out. The road ahead was blocked by a fallen tree. Natural or arranged, he could not immediately tell. Pollard was up on the box, very still, which meant Pollard had assessed the situation and found it worth being still about. On either side of the road, nothing visible. Which told him nothing useful, because if this was an ambush, nothing visible was exactly what he should expect. "Stay in the carriage," he said back through the door. "You said that before," Celeste said, from directly behind him. She had moved to the door as quickly as he had. "The answer hasn't improved." He stepped down onto the road. The countryside here was open on both sides, flat, farmed, the nearest tree line 50 yards east. If there were men in the trees, they had a clean line, and there was no useful cover between the carriage and the tree line. He stood in the road and waited. The figure came from the west, from behind a stone wall he had assessed as too low for concealment, and had therefore discounted, which was, he noted with a particular cold clarity, exactly the kind of assumption a man made when he had been operating alone for too long and had stopped accounting for the fact that other people knew his patterns. The figure walked toward him with the unhurried pace of a man holding a significant advantage. Not Voss, not one of the riders from the moor. Someone he knew. Someone whose face he had seen across a dinner table, across a desk, in the anteroom of the parliamentary committee room where Nathaniel had first begun presenting his findings 14 months ago. Marcus Hale, his own solicitor. The man who had spent 14 months helping him decode Hargrove's correspondence. The man who knew every piece of evidence Nathaniel had gathered. The man who had, Nathaniel now understood with the retrospective clarity of a man seeing the entire mechanism for the first time, been positioned exactly where he needed to be to ensure that the investigation never reached the right conclusion. "Nathaniel," Hale said. Pleasant. Almost apologetic. The voice of a man who had made a calculation and was mildly sorry about the human cost of it. The cold in Nathaniel's chest was not surprise. This was the worst part. He recognized instantly that it was not surprise. Somewhere below the level of conscious thought, some part of him had been carrying the possibility without allowing it to surface, because the surface was where he had to function, and functioning had required a structure of trust, and he had needed Hale inside that structure to do what he was trying to do. He had needed Hale, and Hale had known it. And someone else had known that Hale could be bought or threatened or had always been theirs, and had let the investigation run long enough to map every thread Nathaniel had pulled. "How long?" Nathaniel said. 2 words, no inflection. "Does it matter?" Hale stopped 6 feet away. 2 men had come around the end of the stone wall behind him. They were not carrying weapons visibly, which was a specific kind of message. "I'm here to make you an offer, not an accounting. You've been reporting to Pemberton." "I've been managing a situation." Hale's voice remained pleasant. This was what Nathaniel found, in the functional part of his mind that had not yet been fully overtaken by the thing currently happening in his chest. Most repellent. Not the betrayal, but the pleasantness. The professional equanimity of a man who had decided to sell another man's work and found it unremarkable. "You've gathered impressive material. Lord Pemberton acknowledges that. He's also prepared to make it worth your while to allow this investigation to close without reaching any formal proceeding. He wants to buy it. He wants to end it. There's a distinction. Hale glanced at the carriage door where Celeste had appeared and was watching with the specific expression of a person recognizing a pattern they had already catalogued. And he wants her returned to the arrangement that's been keeping her safe. Keeping her contained, Nathaniel said. Same thing from the right perspective. Nathaniel looked at Hale, at the face he had trusted across 14 months of careful work, the face that had been present for every significant moment of the investigation, every document decoded, every thread identified, and felt, in the controlled interior machinery of himself, something that was not rage exactly, and not grief exactly, but was composed of both and was very old and had been waiting a very long time for a target it could justify. "What's the offer?" he said. "Clear your debts. Your northern estates. I know the yield has been poor for 3 seasons. A sum sufficient to address that, plus enough remaining to make the rest comfortable." Hale's tone remained reasonable, transactional. "Walk away from this. Allow the lady to return to her current arrangement, and this ends cleanly." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. In that moment, everything he had spent 3 years building, the careful architecture of evidence, the methodical patience of a man who had made investigation into a substitute for grief, reorganized itself in his mind into a single clear picture of what it had all actually been. Not justice. Not yet. A foundation. A beginning. And this man standing 6 feet in front of him in a road blocked by a fallen tree had been present for every stone of it. "No," Nathaniel said. Hale's pleasantness flickered, just slightly. "Nathaniel. No." Flat. Final. The word delivered with the full weight of a man who has decided something and closed the door behind him. "You've read every document I have. You know every witness I've identified. You've reported all of it to a man who has been orchestrating political corruption and covering the deaths of people who got in his way." He took one step forward. "You've read everything, which means you know that what I have is enough. Not enough to move through the channels Pemberton has compromised, but enough to make the case so publicly, so completely, so irrefutably documented that suppression becomes more dangerous than exposure. You know that. Pemberton knows that. That's why you're here with an offer instead of a threat." Hale looked at him. The pleasantness was entirely gone now. "The offer won't come again," Hale said. "I know." Behind him, Nathaniel heard Celeste step down from the carriage. She came to stand beside him. Not behind him, with the bundle of papers held against her chest and her chin level and her eyes on Hale with the particular quality of a woman who had spent 2 years cataloging dangerous men and knew precisely which category this one belonged to. "Tell Pemberton," she said, and her voice was very steady and very cold and carried the weight of 2 years of a manufactured life and every name on every list she had kept, "that the next time someone speaks to us, it will be before the House of Lords." Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Nathaniel, and in his face was something that was almost, in its own compromised way, honest. The recognition of a man who had misjudged the distance between where he stood and where the danger was. He stepped back. He nodded once. Not agreement, acknowledgement. He turned and walked back toward the stone wall. The 2 men followed. In the road, in the quiet that followed, Nathaniel stood beside the woman who had been his wife and was still his wife and did not yet know what she remembered or what she chose to claim, and they were both very still for a moment, which was the closest either of them had come to rest in a very long time. Then she said quietly, looking at the fallen tree blocking the road, "We need to move that." "Yes," he said, "and we need to reach London before Hale does." "Yes." She looked at him. Her face had the new quality it had been developing since the moor. Not the practiced blankness, not the raw, stripped thing underneath it, but something third, something that was beginning to form between the two. Something that had not existed in her when she was Celeste Blackthorne, and had not been possible in the person calling herself Evelyn Hart, and was emerging now in the space between those 2 identities. "What do we do when we get there?" she said. He looked at the tree, at the road beyond it, at the gray sky moving east ahead of them, toward London, toward Harrington, toward the end of something or the beginning of it. "We stop running," he said, and we make them run instead." She held his gaze for one more second, and then she set her bundle of papers on the carriage step, walked to the fallen tree, and began to pull. He walked around to the other end, and together, without speaking, they moved it out of the road. They reached London in the dark. Pollard drove without stopping, changing horses twice at posting inns where Nathaniel paid in cash and gave no names, and by the time the city's outer edges appeared through the carriage windows, gas lamps bleeding orange into the wet air, the distant clatter of night traffic on cobblestone. Celeste had fallen into something that was not quite sleep, but was close enough to it that her head had come to rest against the side of the carriage, and her breathing had steadied, and her hands had finally loosened their grip on the bundle of papers. Nathaniel did not sleep. He sat across from her in the dark and thought. He thought about Hale, about 14 months of shared work, shared meals, shared confidence, and the specific anatomy of that betrayal. Not dramatic, not passionate, just transactional. A man who had weighed Nathaniel's trust against Pemberton's money and found the math straightforward. The worst betrayals, Nathaniel had come to understand, were never the passionate ones. Passion implied that the other person had genuinely wrestled with the decision. Hale had not wrestled. He had simply chosen, with the same flat efficiency a man applied to any financial calculation, and gone on being pleasant about it. What that told him, what it had always told him in every iteration of this particular lesson across his life, was that the most dangerous thing a man in his position could do was confuse professional proximity with loyalty. He had made that error once, badly, with consequences that had cost him 3 years and nearly cost him everything else. He did not intend to make it again. He looked at Celeste's sleeping face and thought about the document she carried and the 2 years she had spent in a borrowed life, gathering intelligence with no mechanism to use it, surviving with the specific unglamorous competence of someone who had been stripped of every advantage and had built new ones from whatever the wreckage offered. He thought about what she had said on the moor. "I've been surviving." And what he had said back, those aren't different things. He had meant it as a practical observation. Sitting in the dark carriage, watching London assemble itself outside the window, he understood it was also the truest thing either of them had said to each other. Man. Lord Chief Justice Harrington received them at 6 in the morning. This was not a small thing. Harrington was a man of severe schedule and severe temperament, who had risen at 5 for 30 years and regarded unannounced visitors as a form of personal aggression. His butler had attempted to turn them away at the door, and Nathaniel had handed the man a card with 4 words written on the back in his own hand. Pemberton. Hargrove's ledger. Now. They were shown to the study in under 3 minutes. Harrington was 61, built like a man who had spent decades leaning across judgment benches, with a face that had long ago settled into an expression of permanent skeptical attention. He looked at Nathaniel, he looked at Celeste, he looked at the documents spread across his desk. He did not speak for a long time. "The ledger is authenticated?" he said finally. "I have the cipher key in Hargrove's own hand," Nathaniel said. "The banking records corroborate 4 of the 12 entries. The parliamentary testimony inconsistencies are documented against the original sworn depositions. And this," Harrington held up Celeste's list, the names, the dates, the notations beside each one. "This is your own record." 2 years of direct observation, Celeste said. Her voice was level. She had not slept enough, and she was in clothes that had crossed a moor in rain, and she sat in the Lord Chief Justice's study with the particular composure of someone who had decided, at some specific point in the past several hours, to stop managing herself and simply be the most capable version of what she was. "I can speak to every entry." Harrington looked at her for a long moment. "You understand what it means to testify to this publicly." "I understand what it means not to," she said. Something in the old man's face shifted, not softening exactly, more like the adjustment of a mechanism encountering the correct key. He turned back to Nathaniel. "Hale will have reached Pemberton by now," Harrington said. "Yes. Which means Pemberton knows the scope of what you have. Which means he's already calculating his response. Not suppression. It's too late for suppression. Discrediting. He'll move to discredit the evidence before it reaches any formal proceeding." Nathaniel leaned forward, which is why the proceeding cannot be formal. Not initially. It needs to be public first. The House of Lords in open session, with press admitted. Make the case in a room where suppression is witnessed rather than exercised. Harrington was quiet. Outside, London was waking up. The distant percussion of the city assembling itself, indifferent to what was being decided in this room. I can call an emergency session of the Lords on a matter of national integrity, Harrington said slowly. I have done it twice in 30 years. The procedural justification requires documentation of imminent threat to public order. He looked at Celeste's list. The death of a parliamentary witness qualifies. Yes, Nathaniel said. It will take 48 hours to assemble. We have less than that before Pemberton makes his countermove. I'm aware. Harrington stood. He was taller than Nathaniel remembered. Or perhaps it was the weight of what he was agreeing to, some physical manifestation of the thing being placed in the room between them. I will need the ledger, both sets of documents, and I will need her prepared to speak. He looked at Celeste. Not deposed, not managed by counsel. I need her to stand in that room and say what she knows, in her own words, in front of every man Pemberton has ever purchased. Celeste held his gaze. When do we begin? What? The 48 hours that followed were the most dangerous of Nathaniel's life, and they were dangerous in the specific way that waiting is dangerous. The threat present but unresolvable, the enemy's move unknown, the only available action preparation. They did not return to Blackthorne House. Nathaniel did not trust it. Hale had been there too many times, knew the staff, knew the layout. He installed them instead in a property belonging to a man named Ellsworth, an old ally whose connection to Nathaniel was not documented anywhere that Hale would have thought to look. Ellsworth asked no questions. He provided rooms, food, and the specific, incurious hospitality of a man who had survived a long life by knowing when other people's business was not his. In those 48 hours, 3 things happened. The first, Nathaniel received word, through a contact at the Home Office, whose loyalty he had verified by a method that had nothing to do with Hale, that Pemberton had filed a formal complaint with the tribunal citing Nathaniel for improper acquisition of confidential legal documents. The complaint was a delay tactic. It would not survive scrutiny, and Pemberton knew it, but it was designed to create procedural noise around any evidence Nathaniel presented, to muddy the water enough that individual lords could claim confusion as a reason to abstain. The second, a man appeared at Ellsworth's door at midnight on the second night and handed the footman an envelope addressed to Celeste. Inside was a single sheet, no signature, 6 words. The innkeeper at Dunore knows everything. She read it in the kitchen with Nathaniel standing across the table and her face doing the calculation visible. Aldred, she said, the woman who helped settle me in. Voss spoke to her. If they've threatened her, she can't recant what she hasn't formally said, Nathaniel said. Whatever she told Voss about your behavior over 2 years, it's not sworn testimony. It can't be used to preempt yours. He watched her face. It's another pressure tactic. They're trying to make you feel exposed before you walk into that room. It's working, she said flatly. He respected that. She did not pretend it wasn't. It's supposed to, he said. The question isn't whether it's working. The question is what you do with it. She set the letter down. She looked at him across the table, the same look she had given him in the cottage doorway 2 days ago, a lifetime ago. The look he was beginning to understand was not wariness, but the specific evaluation of a woman deciding whether something was worth the cost. Why did you keep looking? She said. 3 years, you had a death ruling, you had no body, but you had evidence enough for any official determination. She held his gaze. Why didn't you stop? He thought about how to answer this, thought about the 4 versions he had constructed in the inn at Ashford and how they had all dissolved when it came to it. Because the evidence had a gap, he said, and I'm not capable of leaving a gap in evidence. She looked at him for a moment, something in her face that was almost briefly a different expression than the ones he had catalogued so far. That's the least romantic answer anyone has ever given to that question, she said. It's the true one. A beat. I know, she said, and turned back to the letter. The third thing happened on the morning of the session. They were in the carriage, Nathaniel, Celeste, and Harrington's clerk with the documents. When Pollard knocked on the roof, Nathaniel opened the window. Rider behind us, Pollard said, matching our pace since Whitehall. Nathaniel leaned out far enough to see. One rider, dark coat, the same large horse built for distance he had noted 2 days ago on the road out of Dunmore Hollow. The same rider. "Don't stop," Nathaniel said. Don't increase speed. Get us to the Lord's entrance and stay with the carriage." He closed the window. Celeste was watching him. "Voss?" she said. "His man. Same horse." He looked at the document case on the seat between them. "They're not going to make a move in public, in daylight, outside Parliament. This is surveillance. Pemberton wants to know if we're actually going to walk into that room. And if we are, then he has one option left." He looked at her directly. "He puts everything on discrediting you in the room. He'll have someone ready, appear willing to challenge your identity, your memory, your 2 years of isolation. He'll try to make your own history the weapon." She absorbed this without flinching. "What's the answer to that? You tell the truth faster than he can construct the lie." He held her gaze. "Every specific detail you remember, every date, every name, every letter you copied by hand. You make the record so dense and so specific that the challenge can't find purchase. And if my memory has gaps, everyone's memory has gaps. That's not the weakness they'll use." He paused. "The weakness they'll use is the 2 years of a false name. They'll argue the identity confusion serves your interests, that a woman calling herself Evelyn Hart for 2 years has reason to claim an illustrious identity she can't otherwise prove. How do we answer that?" He reached into his coat. He removed the photograph, the small, slightly bent thing he had carried for 3 years against his chest. He placed it on the seat between them. She looked at it. In the silence, with the carriage moving through London morning traffic, and the distant sound of the city doing what cities did, regardless of what individual humans were deciding, he watched her look at the photograph of the two of them at a function neither of them could now name. And he watched something happen in her face that was neither the practiced blankness nor the raw stripped thing underneath it, but the third thing that had been forming since the moor. Her hand moved toward it, stopped. "The scar above your eyebrow," he said quietly. "You got it at 17, a riding accident at your cousin's estate in Dorset. You told me about it on the 3rd night of our marriage because we had been talking in the dark for 3 hours, and you said you had run out of more important things to say." She was very still. "The room at Blackthorne Manor, where you kept your books," he said. "North-facing. You said you preferred it because the light didn't change enough to be distracting. You had 7 shelves and you organized them by the year you first read the book, not the author, which made them nearly impossible for anyone else to find anything in." He kept his voice level, factual. A man presenting evidence. "You cannot stand the smell of lilies. You have a habit of reading the last page of a book before you decide whether to begin it. You whistle slightly off-key when you're concentrating on something that requires your hands." Her breath had changed. He could hear it, the involuntary alteration in its rhythm that happens when the body encounters something it was not prepared for. "Stop," she said. Not loud. "You called the horse with the white mark on its foreleg Apollo. He was a gray and 17 hands, and you had him from the time you were 20 until 2 months before the accident, when he was retired to pasture." He paused. "He is still in the south field at Blackthorne Manor, 11 years old, still there." She pressed her hand flat on the photograph. "Stop," she said again, and this time it was not a request and not a command, but something rawer than both. The sound of a person who's carefully maintained distance from something has been closed by someone who knew exactly where the door was. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he said. "I know." Her voice had gone very low. "That's why you need to stop." He stopped. They rode in silence for 2 blocks. Then she said, without looking up from her hand on the photograph, "Apollo is still there." "Yes." "You kept him." "Yes." Another silence. Outside, the Palace of Westminster was visible now through the carriage window, its stone face impassive in the gray morning, the flags moving in the river wind. "I remember the smell of that room," she said quietly, "the north-facing room. I remember there was a draft from the window that never fully sealed. In winter, it made a sound." She stopped. "I didn't know I remembered that." He said nothing. He understood, with the particular acuity of a man who had spent 3 years becoming very careful about the difference between pushing and waiting, that this was a moment that required only his stillness. "I still don't fully remember you," she said. It came out careful and honest and without apology. "I want to be clear about that. I won't perform a recognition I don't have." "I know. But I remember the room." She looked up. Her eyes were very clear. "And I know those names on that list. And I know what Voss did and why, and who gave the order." She took the photograph and placed it in the pocket of her coat. "So let's go in there and end this." The chamber of the House of Lords held 212 peers on that morning. It also held, in the press gallery above, 14 journalists, because Harrington had ensured word reached the right desks the previous evening. And the right desks had sent their best men, and the best men had come early and taken seats with the particular alertness of people who understood they were about to witness something that would not be containable once it began. Pemberton was there. Nathaniel saw him across the chamber, a man of 60, silver-haired, with the practiced surface ease of someone who had navigated power long enough to mistake comfort for safety. He was flanked by 2 allies, and he was speaking quietly to them with the demeanor of a man who was not concerned. He had not yet seen Celeste. Nathaniel watched the exact moment he did. It was when they entered the chamber floor, Nathaniel first, Celeste beside him, Harrington behind. And the ambient noise of the room changed the way ambient noise changes when something unexpected enters a space. A modulation, a shift, heads turning, the spread of attention across a room like a wave looking for shore. Pemberton's gaze found Celeste and stopped. And in his face, just for a moment, less than a second, before the practiced surface reassembled, was something that confirmed everything. Not guilt. Pemberton was not a man who carried guilt. What crossed his face was the specific expression of a chess player who has looked at the board and understood, for the first time, that a piece he believed removed from the game had been on the board all along. Then his face closed and he turned to speak to his nearest ally, and Nathaniel could see from across the chamber the rapid quiet instruction being issued, the countermove being assembled in real time. Harrington called the session to order. Nathaniel presented the evidence. He had done this 47 times in smaller rooms and had become, through repetition and necessity, very good at it. The precise sequencing of documentation, the building of a case brick by brick in a manner that constructed its own momentum, each piece leading to the next with the logic of something that had always been true and was only now being seen. He spoke for 31 minutes. Several peers interrupted with procedural challenges. He answered each one without pausing the overall structure, the way a man walks through rain without letting it change his direction. Then he sat. And Celeste stood. Pemberton's ally, a lord named Stanwick, whose connection to Pemberton's network appeared twice in Hargrove's ledger, rose immediately. "My lords, the credibility of this witness is itself in question. A woman who spent 2 years living under a false identity." "The false identity," Celeste said without raising her voice, "was arranged by a solicitor named Thomas Hargrove, paid for by funds traceable to an account managed by Lord Pemberton's private secretary, and assigned to me 11 days after my personal solicitor was replaced by a man in Lord Pemberton's legal office. I can document each of those facts. Can Lord Stanwick document a reason for that coincidence that does not implicate himself?" Silence. In the press gallery, 14 pens moved. Stanwick sat down. Celeste spoke for 22 minutes. She did not read from notes. She delivered names, dates, observations, and the specific details of what she had seen and heard and recorded over 2 years with the methodical precision of a woman who had spent that time knowing this moment was the only version of the future she was willing to accept. She spoke about Voss. She spoke about the man who had withdrawn his testimony and subsequently died. She spoke about Aldred and the mill owner and the rider on the Crestwood Road. She spoke about the note that had come through her window and what it had told her about who was watching and why. Halfway through her testimony, Pemberton rose. "My lords," he said, with the full command of a man accustomed to having command recognized, "this is a performance, a woman with no verifiable history for 3 years, presenting documents of questionable provenance, making accusations that Lord Pemberton, Harrington's voice cut across the chamber with the weight of 30 years of judgment. "You will have the opportunity to respond in turn. You will sit down." The room was very still. Pemberton remained standing for one more second, the beat of a man calculating whether his authority in this room was still sufficient to override the procedural structure, and then he sat. And in that second, Nathaniel understood that they had won the first part. The public record existed now. The journalist's pens had captured it. Whatever Pemberton did next this morning was documented and witnessed and could not be unmade. What Pemberton did next arrived faster than Nathaniel had calculated. The door at the rear of the chamber opened. 2 men entered. Not peers, not staff. The way they moved through a room communicated something that rooms communicated regardless of what the people in them wanted. Voss was behind them. He stopped at the entrance to the floor and looked across the chamber with the professional assessment of a man arriving to manage a situation, and his eyes went directly to Celeste, and then to the document case on the table in front of Nathaniel, and then to Nathaniel himself. And then he reached into his coat. Down. Nathaniel was already moving, already across the distance, the calculation completed before the thought was fully formed. But the chamber was large and Voss was fast, and Celeste was standing in the open, still at the witness position, and she had not yet seen him. She was still looking at Pemberton, and Nathaniel was not going to make it. "Celeste." She turned. And in the turning, in the split second of her looking from Pemberton to Voss to Nathaniel crossing the chamber floor at a dead run, something happened in her face that was not fear and not confusion, but the violent surface-breaking arrival of something that had been submerged for 3 years. Recognition, not of a memory, but of a moment. The body understanding danger, the way the body always understood danger, faster than the mind, in the muscles and the blood and the specific calibration of survival that did not require conscious knowledge to function. She moved, not away. She moved toward the table, toward the document case, toward the evidence, protecting it with her body the way Nathaniel had seen her protect the papers on the moor, the same instinct, the same unflinching prioritization. And Voss's hand was coming out of his coat, and the chamber was erupting around them, lords rising, voices colliding, the press gallery above them surging forward against the rail. And in the last fraction of a second before everything that came next, Nathaniel reached her. His arm came across her, turning her body behind his, and he looked directly at Voss across the chaos of the chamber. And what he felt, in that exact instant, with the full weight of 3 years of grief and 14 months of betrayal and 48 hours of movement and the specific quality of her shoulder under his arm, was not fear. It was, with a clarity so cold it was almost peaceful, the complete and total absence of anything left to lose. Voss did not fire. What he had drawn from his coat was not a weapon. It was a document, folded, sealed, the kind of thing a man produces when he has decided that the situation has moved beyond the reach of cruder solutions and requires a different instrument entirely. He held it up with the deliberate visibility of someone who needed the room to see what he was holding before anyone did anything irreversible. "A letter," he said, loudly enough to cut through the chamber noise. "From Lord Pemberton's private secretary, dated 14 months ago, addressed to the Home Office liaison. It documents the authorization for the surveillance operation on the Blackthorne investigation." He looked directly at Pemberton. Authorization signed by Pemberton himself. The chamber went very quiet. Nathaniel's arm was still across Celeste. He did not move it immediately. He stood with his body between her and the room and processed what he had just seen. A man who had come in as Pemberton's instrument and was now producing evidence against him. And the only question that mattered was why, and the answer arrived in the same moment as the question, because Voss's face carried the specific expression of a man who had looked at the board and made the calculation that his employer was finished and that the only remaining variable was which side of the ending he wanted to be on. Voss was defecting. Not from conscience, from arithmetic. Nathaniel lowered his arm. He looked at Celeste. She was steady, her breathing controlled, her eyes moving between Voss and Pemberton with the particular assessment of a woman who had spent 2 years learning to read dangerous men. She gave him a single small nod. She had reached the same conclusion. He crossed the chamber floor to Voss. He took the document. He did not thank him. He turned and placed it on the table with the rest of the evidence and looked at Harrington. "My lords," Harrington said, into the silence that had settled over 212 peers and 14 journalists. "I believe we have sufficient material to proceed." Pemberton rose for the second time. He was still composed. The surface of him was still composed. But something underneath it had changed, the way the structural integrity of a building changes before the visible collapse. He looked at Voss with a quality of attention that was completely without expression, which was its own kind of expression. And then he looked at Nathaniel, and then he looked at Celeste. He sat back down without speaking. It was the loudest thing he could have done. The session lasted 4 more hours. Nathaniel sat through all of it with the controlled patience of a man who had been building toward this room for 3 years and was not going to squander its conclusion by relaxing before it was complete. He answered procedural questions. He provided corroborating documentation at 5 separate points where opposing peers attempted to introduce doubt into the record. He watched Pemberton's allies recalculate their positions in real time, the ones with sufficient survival instinct beginning to manufacture visible distance from the man they had spent years standing beside. Celeste did not sit. She stood at the witness position for the duration, which was not required of her, and which she had apparently decided to do anyway. And her stillness over 4 hours was the kind that communicates something beyond patience. The stillness of a person who has stood in small, borrowed rooms for 2 years and finds a large hostile chamber entirely manageable by comparison. At one point, a peer named Croft, one of Pemberton's oldest allies, a man whose name appeared in Hargrove's ledger 3 separate times, rose and said, with the particular tone of a man attempting to sound reasonable while executing a strategy, "The question of this woman's identity remains, my lords, materially unresolved. Her own testimony acknowledges a period of 2 years in which she operated under a false name, during which time her memory of her prior life was, by her own admission, incomplete. How can this chamber accept as credible? Lord Croft?" Celeste's voice crossed the chamber with an evenness that required no volume to carry. "My name is Celeste Blackthorne. I am the wife of Nathaniel Blackthorne, 8th Duke of Blackthorne. I was born at Ashmore House in Devonshire in 1841. My father was the 3rd Earl of Ashmore. My mother was Eleanor Vane before her marriage. I have a scar above my left eyebrow from a riding accident at 17. I keep my books organized by the year I first read them, which makes them useless to anyone else, and I cannot stand the smell of lilies." She paused. "If Lord Croft requires further identification, I suggest he examine the parish register at St. Michael's in Ashmore, where my birth is recorded, or the marriage register at St. George's in London, where my marriage is recorded, or the estate records at Blackthorne Manor, where my presence as its mistress is documented across 6 years of household accounts. I am not incomplete, my lord. I am inconvenient. Those are different things." Croft sat down. In the press gallery, someone dropped a pen. The sound was very clear in the silence. Nathaniel looked at her across the chamber floor and felt something that had been compressed for 3 years, something he had been storing in that locked chamber of his chest, where he had put everything that could not be useful. Shift and release, and settle into a different configuration. Not gone. Reconfigured. The grief that had been running the machinery for so long making room, reluctantly and with significant structural protest, for something that was not grief. Pemberton's formal removal from public life took 6 weeks from that morning. The criminal proceedings were slower. The law was always slower than the truth, but they were thorough, and Harrington was personally invested in thoroughness. And the 14 journalists who had been in the press gallery produced 14 separate accounts of the session that collectively made suppression not merely difficult, but functionally impossible. Voss's letter added the keystone. Hale's connection to the network was documented and prosecuted separately. Croft resigned his seat before the follow-on inquiry reached him. Nathaniel spent those 6 weeks in London, managing the legal dimensions of what they had set in motion. He slept in his own house for the first time in months. He sat at his own desk. He ate meals in his own dining room with the strange quality of a man reoccupying a space that had become unfamiliar through long absence. Not quite comfortable yet, not quite foreign, somewhere in the adjustment between the two. Celeste stayed initially at a house in Kensington belonging to her cousin, the cousin she had been traveling to visit 3 years ago when the carriage went over the river crossing. Her cousin, a woman named Harriet, who had spent 3 years believing her dead and had apparently processed that grief by becoming someone with very few diplomatic instincts and a great deal of unresolved anger, had opened the door at their first meeting, looked at Celeste for 3 seconds and said, "You look terrible. Come in." Nathaniel knew about the reunion secondhand. Celeste had told him about it in 3 sentences when they next met, and the 3 sentences contained everything necessary and nothing decorative, which was, he was learning, her characteristic economy when speaking about things that mattered. They met formally 3 times during those 6 weeks. Not formally in the social sense, there was nothing social about what they were doing. Formally in the sense that each meeting had a purpose external to themselves. A document to review, a statement to coordinate, a question of legal strategy requiring both their inputs. They sat across tables from each other in solicitors' offices and Harrington's anteroom, and once in a coffee house near the courts because there was nowhere else available, and they conducted the business of dismantling the architecture that had been built around their lives. And they were professional about it, and efficient, and the conversation they were not having occupied the space around every conversation they were having with the specific weight of something that has been deferred past the point of pretending it isn't there. After the 6th week, the legal machinery had sufficient momentum to proceed without his daily management. He wrote her a letter. It was short. He was not by nature or practice a man who wrote long letters, and what he wanted to say did not require length. It required only accuracy, and he was good at accuracy. The letter said, "I have no intention of making any claims on you. What was arranged between us before was arranged under circumstances that neither of us fully chose and that are now, in any case, 3 years gone. What you choose now is yours to choose, without obligation to what was, and without pressure from me. I would like, if you are willing, to show you something at Blackthorne Manor. After that, whatever you decide I will respect without qualification. N." She wrote back the following morning. Her letter was also short. It said, "When?" They drove to Blackthorne Manor on a Thursday in late November. The countryside had given itself over to the particular gray-brown of late autumn, everything stripped back to its structural truth, the shapes of trees visible without their cover, the land showing its actual contours beneath the dead grass. Nathaniel had always found this time of year more honest than the rest. There was something in the absence of decoration that made it easier to see what was actually there. They did not speak much on the road. They had arrived, over the preceding weeks, at a silence between them that was different from the silences of the cottage doorway and the carriage and the chamber floor, less defended, more inhabited. The silence of people who have been through something together and no longer need to perform the performance of not being through something together. Blackthorne Manor came into view around the last bend in the approach road, gray stone against gray sky, the avenue of oaks on either side stripped to their winter architecture, the house itself exactly as it had always been, which was to say large and serious and built to last by people who believed that permanence was a virtue rather than an illusion. He watched her face as it came into view. She was looking at it with the specific quality of attention she had given the photograph in the carriage. Not the performance of recognition, but the real thing, tentative and involuntary, a woman looking at something and finding more inside herself in response to it than she had been prepared for. "The north wing," she said quietly. Not to him exactly, to herself or to the house. "3rd floor," he said. "The window that never sealed." She did not say anything. But her hand, which had been resting on the seat between them, moved and came to rest against his. And it was not a dramatic gesture, and it was not a declared one. It was the gesture of a body doing what it intended to do before the mind had voted on the question. He did not move. He let it be there, her hand against his, and looked at his house coming toward them down the avenue of winter oaks, and felt the weight of 3 years of absence settle and discharge, in the particular way that things discharge when they have finally been given somewhere to go. He took her to the south field first. Apollo was there. 11 years old now, still gray, the white mark on his foreleg exactly as it had always been, moving along the fence line with the unhurried dignity of a horse who had been well kept and knew it. He heard them approach and came to the fence, and put his head over the rail with the equine curiosity that does not diminish with age. Celeste stopped at the fence. She stood there for a moment. Then she reached up and put her hand on the horse's face, and Apollo leaned into it with the trust of an animal that remembers what it has been given. And she stood very still with her hand on his face and her eyes closed. And Nathaniel stood 2 feet behind her and gave her that, completely, without intervention. When she turned around, her face was clear, not the controlled clearness of the cottage doorway, the clearness of something resolved. "I remember him," she said. "Not the way I remember a fact, the way I remember something I loved." He nodded. "I'm not all the way back," she said. "I want to be clear about that. There are still gaps. There are things from before that I reach for and don't find. I don't know how much of that is permanent." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to know that. Not as a warning, as a truth." "I know it," he said. "And you're not waiting for the version of me that existed before. You understand that she may not fully come back." "I'm not waiting for a version," he said. "I'm standing in a field in November with the version that's here." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the dry grass. Apollo shifted behind her with the comfortable weight of an animal with nowhere to be. "3 years ago," she said, "I was going to tell you something. When I came back from Harriet's, I had decided on the road that I was going to tell you something I had been not telling you for some time." She stopped. "I don't remember exactly what it was. I remember deciding to say it. I remember it felt important. I remember I was going to say it when I got home." He waited. "I think," she said, "it might have been that I had stopped being afraid of you." He absorbed that. He knew what it cost. Not the telling, but the original fact, and the years it had taken her to arrive at it, and the specific architecture of damage in both of them that had made fear a reasonable starting point. He had not been an easy man to marry. He had not known, at 28, how to be anything other than what he was, which was capable and closed and better at evidence than at the unstructured vulnerability of being known by another person. He was not certain he was much better at it now, but he was standing in a field, and she was standing in front of him, and they had dismantled a conspiracy together over 4 days, and he had watched her stand in the House of Lords and name herself without flinching, and he understood, with the precise clarity of a man who has spent 3 years learning the difference between what he needs and what he can afford to need, that what he felt for her had never been the clean, uncomplicated thing that people who had not lived inside it imagined marriage to be. It was the specific, complicated weight of 2 people who had been trying, imperfectly, to build something honest out of materials that included their own considerable damage. That was not less than the clean version. It was more. It was real. "I'm not afraid of you either," he said, "for what it's worth. I'm not sure I ever was. I think I was afraid of needing something I didn't know how to ask for." She looked at him. "And now?" "Now I'm asking." He held her gaze. "Stay. Not as an obligation, not as a restoration of what was, because what was is gone and we are different people inside it. And I have no interest in pretending otherwise. Stay because we are standing here and there is something between us that survived 3 years of separation and a conspiracy and a moor crossing and the House of Lords, and I would like to find out what it becomes." He paused. "That's the entirety of what I'm asking." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and warmth in equal measure. "The north-facing room," she said finally. "Yes. I want my books back in order. They haven't been touched." Something in her face, not quite a smile, but the interior movement that precedes one in a person who has been careful with their face for a long time and is beginning to remember that they do not have to be. "Then yes," she said. "I'll stay." They opened the front doors of Blackthorne Manor together just before dark. The house staff, forewarned by Pollard, who had said nothing to anyone and everything to the right people, had lit the lamps. The entrance hall was warm, the stone floors gleaming in the yellow light, the staircase rising to the upper floors with the solid permanence of something that had been waiting a long time and had not found the waiting particularly difficult, because stone did not find things difficult. It simply endured until the people came back. Nathaniel stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. His house, his inheritance, the place he had left each morning for 3 years to go looking for something he had not been able to name cleanly, even to himself. The place he had returned to each night with the specific quality of absence that a house develops when it is inhabited by a person who is not fully present in it. He had been half a man in this house, not from lack of trying, from the specific wound of a loss that had no clean shape, not a death, as it turned out, but also not a life he could go back to, because the woman who had left it was not entirely the woman standing beside him now. And the man who had stood here the morning she didn't come home was not entirely the man he was now, either. And the space between those two versions of both of them was not a wound anymore. It was room. Room for something that had not existed before and could not have, because it was built from what they had each become in the years of surviving the absence of each other. He understood this without quite having words for it, the way you understand the truest things, in the body, below the level of articulation, as a fact that arrived before you had the language to receive it. Celeste stepped across the threshold. She stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the staircase, and then around at the lamps, and then at her own hands in the warm light, and something in her face was very quiet and very present. Not the practiced quiet of the cottage doorway, not the stripped rawness of the moor, but the third thing, settled now, the quality of a person who has arrived at themselves after a long route and recognizes the arrival without requiring it to be announced. She looked back at him in the doorway. "Come in," she said. "You're letting the cold in." He came in. He closed the doors behind him. The lamps burned steadily. Upstairs in the north-facing room, 7 shelves of books waited in the order she had left them, organized by the year she had first read each one, useless to everyone else. Exactly right. Outside, the November dark settled over Blackthorne Manor with the patience of something that knows the light will return, because it always does. Not the same light, never the same light, but light nonetheless, finding the same windows, filling the same rooms, falling across the faces of people who have earned their quiet by being willing to walk through everything that stood between them and it. The story that had been stolen from them years ago was not returned to them. They had built a different one, in its place, out of the materials available. Endurance and evidence, a moor crossing in the rain, 400 pounds in a dead man's ledger, 14 journalists in an upper gallery, a gray horse who remembered being loved. It was not the story either of them would have written at the beginning. It was the only story that was true. And it began, as the best ones do, exactly where it was.